participants of our roundtable. The topic of our roundtable discussion is related to insurance in the nuclear field, and as a whole we are going to discuss today civil liability for nuclear incidents, and this topic is quite relevant. A nuclear incident is always a catastrophe of a global nature. We all but remember the situation in Fukushima, all the scary pictures we saw on TV. Many of us remember the events that occurred in Chernobyl, which is on one of our minds. And of course the nuclear incident is the worst thing that can happen on the face of Earth. From the one hand it is strange, on the other hand it is quite obvious that over the past several years in the world we have been seeing the so-called nuclear renaissance. Countries that own nuclear technologies are actively expanding the production of nuclear energy. They build nuclear power stations, and of course this brings into the orbit, into nuclear orbit, new countries. Active construction of nuclear power reactors occurs in Eastern Europe, in Asia, and of course such pace of growth exacerbate the risks of nuclear incidents, and the global community cannot but pay attention to this reality. And through international organizations such as IAEA, such as OECD in Europe, that trying to mitigate or reduce the risks related to potential nuclear disasters. And over the past 50 or 60 years, quite a few international conventions, local agreements have been signed geared towards reducing the risks related to the operation of nuclear facilities. Those who are involved in the field of nuclear law know that there are basic conventions on nuclear safety, on physical protection, based on which national legislations are formed in the countries where we have nuclear installations. But of course today we will be talking more about civil liability for damages that may occur in relation to the nuclear disaster. We're going to talk about the Vienna Convention that was signed under the aegis of IAEA, and we're going to talk about Paris and Brussels Conventions that have been signed under the auspices of OECD. As a nuclear field developed, as the number of reactors grew in the world, international organizations, the global community are beginning to think more about enhancing safety and security of nuclear reactors and to ensure novel approaches to the liability of nuclear operators. And over the past several decades we have seen that the scope of liability of operators has grown. Today it is up to $500 million, but this sum of course is not enough to cover all the damages that may ensue as a result of nuclear incident. Japan, after Fukushima, well, the size of compensations that were paid then have already exceeded $100 billion, and this is not the final amount, it's growing all the time. It is quite clear that even such amounts as $500 million that can be charged to the operator may be critical for this operator and may lead to discontinuation of his activity. and his work is, of course, is related to the safety and security of the nuclear facility that this operator has. And in this sense, the international community is trying to introduce some forms of ensuring payments that will have to be made to the victims of a nuclear disaster. And several forms to that effect have been developed. Two of them are of major importance, that is insurance, and such insurance is carried out through traditional, conservative, conventional channels by insurers who form nuclear pools, and another form of insurance is insurance through mutual insurance funds. We're going to talk about these two types of insurance today. Another form that has already been worked out is issuing government guarantees on payments that will have to be made by operators. We're not going to discuss those because this relates to the budgetary process, and we are more oriented towards issues of civil liability. I would like to introduce our speakers today. We have with us Steve Burns. Steve is Director of Legal Affairs of OECD NEA. Steve, apart from being an official of a rather authoritative international organization, he has other other hobbies. He teaches nuclear law at Montpellier University, and in this sense he is doing a very noble work because he teaches the employees of organizations related to the nuclear installations. Many people from Rosatom were Steve's his students, and thank you very much for this. We also have Pavel Rudensky with us, who is president of National Association of Insurers in the Nuclear Field, RANI. And our third speaker is Larisa Sashenko. She is Director General of Risk Profile Company, and before Larisa worked in the Nuclear Safety Department of Applied Ecology Institute, and she also worked at a risk insurance broker. Another speaker is Andrey Popov. He is Deputy Director for Legal and Corporate Affairs of the Legal Department of TechSnap Export, which is the major supplier of nuclear materials in the Russian Federation. And another speaker who is not here, he will join us later after he has got his badge in order to enter the territory. That is Konstantin Sokolov from Rosatom, specializing in various insurance issues of nuclear risks. I would like to give the floor now to Mr. Steve Burns, who will talk about general issues related to civil liability. Stephen, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here in St. Petersburg again this morning. As Ms. Popov said, I will start with some general overview on liability issues and principles. And although we often talk about nuclear reactors, perhaps the highest risk of the installations that are covered under the liability regimes, I'm also to give a few remarks with respect to the regimes and some other areas of interest, particularly in the areas of decommissioning facilities, as well as waste disposal facilities, because this is part of the discussion that's arisen now in the liability regimes. I start from the principle, and we sort of touched on this briefly in the opening remarks, is that most the liability and the compensation regimes, which date back from the early, actually they're in many ways for the civil international convention, or the international conventions related to the safety of installations or civil nuclear safety, the liability conventions are really the oldest ones. The Paris Convention from 1960, the Vienna Convention, as well as the Brussels Supplementary Convention of the Paris Convention from 1963. If you think about it, the Convention on Nuclear Safety and the conventions on notification and assistance did not come about until the 1980s, and then the CNS in 1994. So these conventions have been around a long time, and as I think many of us know, they grew out of the proposition that the development of nuclear energy might require a special regime, given what were perceived then to be the exceptional risks arising from nuclear activities, where it was thought that the common law or the common rules of tort and common rules of liability might not be appropriate. And so a balance in the early days was struck between the ensuring that there was not an undue impediment to development of nuclear energy, while assuring that victims would be compensated in the event of an accident. And so these regimes generally address what I would call the higher risk activities, that is nuclear energy production and use, and they normally do not cover what have been perceived as risks that can be dealt with by the normal tort system. That is, for example, the use of radioactive sources, although I would say that's a question to some extent that may be being re-examined. And again, just to reiterate that there are, within the liability conventions, there are several regimes that although they are at their core consistent and share similar principles. As I say, the OECD is the depositary for the Paris Convention on third-party liability, the oldest of the conventions. Actually, the Belgian government is the depositary for the Brussels Supplementary Convention, and what the Brussels Convention does is supplements the amounts of compensation available under the Paris Convention. And of course, in 2004, 10 years ago, the parties to the Paris Convention and the Brussels parties undertook an effort to update and to revise the convention and adopted 2004 protocols, which are not yet in force. At the bottom there, again, the IAEA is the depositary for the 1963 Vienna Convention, of which the Russian Federation is a contracting party. In 1997, there was a protocol to amend the Vienna Convention, but unlike what, and this one is in force, but unlike what will happen really with the 2004 Paris Convention, the 97 protocol does not replace in its entirety the 1963 Vienna Convention. And then, of course, in 1997 as well, there was the Convention on Supplementary Compensation for Nuclear Damage, which the IAEA promotes as a broader step to a more global liability regime. One significant aspect of the CSC is the fact that this is the convention that the United States joined and says that is the only convention that it could join. But again, the notion is that you would have treaty relations. And I've stuck right in the middle of that slide there the 1988 Joint Protocol, which links the Paris and the Vienna Conventions, and again establishes treaty relations between parties to both conventions, and thus expands the reach of that convention. And so when, for example, today in the discussions of a greater or more globalized liability regime, Particularly, for example, if you look at the recommendations of the what's called the INLEX group, the International Nuclear Liability Expert Group, that is organized under the IAEA, you see, in effect, the joint protocol, or the states or members of the joint protocol, or of the CSC is, in effect, ways to the goal of a more globalized regime. In other words, that they are pathways that can help get us to that point. Again, just to go over the nuclear liability principles very basically, the idea that's embodied, the ideas that are embodied in all of the conventions are essentially those that I've shown here on this slide. Strict liability, that is, the operator is liable without proof of fault or negligence. The idea of exclusive liability, that is, only the operator is liable. There's in a sense, setting the limitation on liability in time. It's generally in the early conventions of the 60 Paris, 63 Vienna, and actually to an extent in the CSC it holds over. But generally it's 10 years from the date of the incident. But in the modernized conventions, 30 years for personal injury, which has created some issues, I think, in the insurance field. And then the time for making a claim generally is 2 to 3 years. That's often the normal, what I'll call the normal tort filing period, after discovery of the damage and identification of the person responsible. In other words, if the damage is in effect nuclear damage. The conventions originated with the concept of sort of a liability limited in amount. Particularly the Paris Convention talked about, in 1960, talked about liability capped or at a ceiling of a certain amount. Under the modernized regimes, actually the 1963 Vienna Convention doesn't speak in those terms. It talks really about a minimum amount, and that's the idea that's embodied in both the 2004 protocols to amend Paris and Brussels, but also in the 1990, it extends also to the 1997 Vienna Protocol as well as the CSC, that the idea is that the amounts set within the convention are a minimum amount, and that states may choose to impose a higher amount of liability on the operator. There are a few countries, particularly Germany, Japan, and Switzerland. We mentioned briefly Japan, and their experience is very interesting in terms of how they have implemented their system, but those countries are examples of those who have, in effect, what they would call an unlimited liability, although that has some pragmatic issues and problems in implementation. Now, part of the idea of that you set a minimum or a maximum liability amount is that those funds are available, and so that there is a compulsory financial security that the operator must hold. And that is to avoid an operator, for example, in my home country in the United States, you have businesses, you have examples of businesses who, facing claims, will declare bankruptcy, and in effect, those claims may be settled for what we used to call 10 cents on the dollar. That is something under the nuclear liability regime that does not happen because of the necessity of maintaining the compulsory financial security. There are a couple jurisdictional issues that are addressed as well in the conventions. This idea of what I'll call unity of jurisdiction, that the courts that have jurisdiction over the claims are those of the country where the incident took place. There are some complications in transport, but let's put those aside for now. And the idea is the encouragement is also that basically you have one court handle the claims, and that's an efficiency matter. And it may be that not all claims go to court. If you look at the Japanese experience, a very small fraction are going into the courts themselves. That partly may be a cultural thing in terms of Japanese culture and in terms of how disputes are resolved. And that's frankly a good thing, because victims will receive compensation and it may not require going to court. But if they do, the idea is that they would have their claims settled in through the courts of a single country where the incident occurred, and the encouragement of a single court. And finally, the idea that is embodied in the conventions is of non-discrimination, and that is the competent courts apply the International Convention and their national law without discrimination based on nationality, domicile, or residence. And that's an issue of fairness to victims who may not necessarily be in the country where the incident occurred. Now, always, and I think as lawyers always say, defining terms and understanding the terms is very important. And I've given you some examples here from the 1960 Paris Convention. And again, what you focus on in reading the conventions is what is a nuclear incident, and how does that carry out. More importantly, perhaps, for some of our discussions we may have, is what is a nuclear installation? And I've given you the Paris definition from 1960, that reactors often, other than those comprised in any means of transport, factories for the manufacture or processing of nuclear substances, factories for the separation of isotopes of nuclear fuel, factories for the reprocessing of irradiated nuclear fuel, facilities for the storage of nuclear substances other than storage incident to carriage, in other words, transport. And in the Paris Convention, you have, and such other installations in which there is nuclear fuel or radioactive products, as the NEA steering committee. That's the steering committee is in effect the governing board of the NEA. As the steering committee may decide, and for example, that would mean all the member states, particularly those of the Paris Convention, or members of the Paris Convention, would decide whether there's an expansion. And there have been a couple instances where that's happened, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Again, with the notion of defining terms, we need to look at nuclear substances. What is nuclear fuel, radioactive products, or waste? And again, most of this is incident to power production, things that are power production or what are called nuclear fuel. It's other than natural uranium or depleted uranium. And it's generally not a radioactive isotope, like a cobalt source that might be used in medicine, or a cesium source used in medicine, or a cobalt source used in an industrial application. So again, they're used in connection with what I'll call the nuclear fuel cycle, but they're not necessarily all the things in there. Now, in a couple instances, and this is where I'm going to switch a little bit and talk more about the back end of the fuel cycle, if you will, the decommissioning and use of waste facilities. Facilities under decommissioning, that is, for example, within Europe, I forget what the number is, but you have a significant number of facilities will be going under decommissioning or under decommissioning. So one of the questions that came up actually a couple decades ago was the clarity with which the convention, at least the Paris Convention, applied to such facilities. And this is one of these examples where the Steering Committee on Nuclear Energy at the NEA made a decision in which it would clarify that such facilities were covered by the convention. One could argue, I think, that looking at the definitions, and again, this is my point about definitions being important, that they were covered, but the Steering Committee removed any question about that. Now, interestingly, in the Vienna Convention, original one, doesn't have this provision for a board like the Steering Committee to make more clarifications or expansion of definitions. The 97 protocol does. But again, looking at the Vienna Convention, you could say under the language, as long as there's fuel, spent fuel, radioactive products at a waste, at a decommissioning site, it's one would argue that it's covered under the Vienna Convention. Although such facilities under decommissioning are covered, in 1990, the steering committee also decided that they could be exempted under national law if they so chose, if a country's member of the convention so chose. And it adopted criteria which were determined about several years ago, 7-8 years ago, were out of date. And now, and actually I'm hoping this year that the revised criteria will be approved by the steering committee, because the 1990 criteria are out of date. Not many countries, we tried to do a little survey, not many countries are all that interested in or have applied this exemption. The UK, the United Kingdom, is interested in it, so that's interesting. So again, we're undergoing some changes there. The other types of facilities I want to mention are waste disposal facilities, the very end of the cycle, if you will. Application of the liability regime under the 1960 Paris Convention is not clearly specified. And again, this was an instance in which in 1984, about 30 years ago, the steering committee decided that installations should be covered without prejudging whether the post-closure status of such a facility should be covered under the convention. So in other words, as long as the low-level waste facility, the high-level waste facility is in, quote, operation, actively monitored, actively managed, this was the decision of the steering committee. In the 2004 protocols, such disposal installations are expressly covered, both pre and post-closure. But again, one of the discussion points now, as waste facilities, and particularly as we started to talk more specifically about high-level waste disposal facilities, the question does come up about whether certain types of things, particularly low-level installations, could be excluded. There is, again, the United Kingdom has been a proponent of that. Some other countries that have been involved in the discussions, for example, France has generally not been in favor of some of the exclusions, but it has an open mind in terms of working with the parties with respect to this issue. But this issue is, I think, going to take some time. And the other discussion point is, what about post-closure? Although they are covered under the Paris Convention, at some point, the idea of some of the waste disposal facilities, and I think, for example, low-level waste, you can imagine within a certain time frames, you would return them basically to a brownfield or greenfield state, and they would not require active management. So the question arises, at what point does it make sense to apply, in effect, the conventions to post-closure? Is there a point where the liability regime, in effect, cuts off or ends? So I think that is a discussion that's going to be had in the next few years. Again, within the Vienna Convention, it's a little more ambiguous, particularly with respect to the application, as I understand it, to the disposal facilities. But again, I think through within the INLEX group and some of the expert groups, as the discussion goes on in liability and there's greater convergence, that will be an issue. So those are my opening remarks. I thank you again for having me here.
Спасибо большое, Steve. Коллеги.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Colleagues, I would like to propose the procedures, the order of the day. So let us have a Q&A session after each presentation, and then we will have a short time for the floor discussion after all the presentations are covered. Do you have any questions for Steve with respect to the general ideas of nuclear liability? Do you think it is realistic to set up the global liability regime? And if it is real, then what is the timetable when the global regime could be in place?
sense what we have instruments that I think allow us to get there. One can argue even with again with the three major conventions, the two being Paris and Vienna, which are linked, and then you have the CSC, which brings in the United States and some others in. You have sort of the basis. What's interesting, I think, on the liability regimes is that, again, as I say, they're the oldest of the, in effect, what I call the safety instruments, but they are the least adhered to. Everybody joins the Convention on Nuclear Safety that has, I think except one country, that has nuclear reactors. But that hasn't been the case in terms of the liability regime. You still have, particularly in, well, you have, I think, what is it, something close to 60% of the reactors aren't covered by an active or a regime that's in force. But I think one of the things that's happened, and this is underlies a joint statement the United States and France made last August, is that recognizing that there may be differences and differences in viewpoint among countries, that there is still sort of a way and an intentionality and a usefulness for sort of pointing toward that. Now, whether that means, beyond my lifetime or, 50 years from now or 100 years from now, is it Paris, Vienna, and CSC, or it is something else? I think that's a question. But I think what we're seeing is we are seeing some progress. From the standpoint, you have Canada, a neighbor of the U.S. who will probably ratify the CSC this year. You have Japan saying it probably will go. And then you have, the question is, and particularly in some major Asian countries, whether that will happen. So I think adherence to the regimes maybe in the next 10 years or so, that's probably likely. How harmonized that is, I think there's still work to do.
Если можно, я тоже задам вопрос.
And what are the prospects of 2004 protocol entering into force?
That's a question we've been asking for a number of years. I think the prospects are actually probably pretty good they're looking better and better. A year ago, I would have said we needed 3 countries, but Belgium has now finished its legislation. It will be formally published this summer in about a month. So there are 2 countries that need to complete the ratification process within their country, the United Kingdom and Italy. And for those of you who don't understand, why is that important, is that because of a decision of the European Council requires simultaneous ratification by member states of the EU, and it has partly to do with EU jurisdictional issues. But it's looking better. I know people in the UK are working on it, as Italy has. They've been contacting us. So I think there's some good hope for 2015, or say by the end of 2015. In other words, it would come in force at the very beginning of 2016.
Another one, if it is okay, the very last one, it's the attitude of the NEA with respect to the coverage of the low-level operators, such as tomographs, X-ray equipment. So how do you take it? Should these entities be covered by liability conventions, that kind of operators?
X-rays are not. X-ray operators would not be covered under the conventions. Again, if you go definitionally, because they don't come from the ionizing radiation. To some extent, that may be a matter of national choice to what extent they put them under the regimes. And again, I would look at sometimes the definition. What the conventions do allow is they do allow, we often talk about reactors. So we talk about, say in the revised Paris Convention, the 700 million euro liability amount. But for what are considered lower risk installations, there are lesser liability amounts. And again, if they fit within the definition of the convention, or again with respect to the national legislation, I think that that may be appropriate for coverage. I would say the one that is not that is generally excluded would be X-rays, because again within the conventions that it would not meet the definition.
Я хотел бы предоставить.
All right, I would now like to give the floor Mr. Shatov, Andrey Shatov, who is the deputy head of the legal service of Rostechno Export. He's going to talk about civil liability in transportation of nuclear materials. Good morning, dear colleagues. My presentation is based on our practical experience in implementing the convention with respect to transportation of nuclear materials from Russia to countries with various legal regimes and in the opposite direction. TechSnap Export works under the global brand 10X. This is Rosatom's exclusive exporter of nuclear materials to countries that use Western-designed reactors rather than Russian-designed reactors. Therefore, we work globally. The only exception is the former communist camp countries, as well as the CIS countries, as well as those countries that still use Russian-made reactors, countries such as China, India, and Iran. Let me begin with listing the main liability principles in the nuclear field. There are several groups of countries here. The first group comprises countries that have special legislation on that particular subject that may be part of domestic legislation. Sometimes it takes the form of accession to an international convention. In these countries, it is the operator who is liable, and we're talking about exclusive liability here. The liability limit is usually specified. Unfortunately, it is not specified in Russia. Compensation guarantees are also established through a mandatory insurance schemes. There is a subsidiary liability of the government in case of insufficient insurance coverage. There is the possibility to create mutuals or insurance pools in order to guarantee compensation. Next, there are limited cases of indemnification. They're really very limited. For instance, if you look at the Japanese law that talks about civil nuclear liability, it says that indemnification takes place when a natural disaster of an exceptional scope has occurred. The Fukushima disaster, as you know, was caused by a tsunami event. The tsunami was recognized as an event that indemnifies the operator, TEPCO. The jurisdiction is also established usually. There is usually unity of jurisdiction if transboundary damage is incurred, provided that the bordering countries are covered by the same convention. The jurisdiction will be established by the very beginning. In countries where there's no special legislation, in these countries there are no guarantees, there are no limits, there are no provisions concerning indemnification. Different courts in different countries can be used. Liability may be extended to the operator, to the construction and assembly vendor, as well as other participants. The well-known situation of that kind is in India. According to India's legislation, there is no exclusive liability of the operator in the law, which precludes many countries from working in this field. In India, for instance, the US is reluctant to build reactors in the US because under India's law, construction and assembly operators as well as other vendors may be liable. Let us turn to the next slide now. I hope you can see clearly what I'm trying to show. Basically, there are several conventions in place. The 1963
Vienna Convention, 1997 Vienna Convention, the Paris Convention, as well as a number of countries with their domestic legislation on these matters. This is the breakdown by country. As you see, there is a lot of diversity here. These are the liability limits in euros for various conventions. Under the Paris Convention, the minimum is 7.7 million euros. The top compensation liability is 23 million euros. Brussels talks about 338 million. If you look at the Vienna Convention, there is a $5 million limit on the basis of a gold parity. According to the latest data, this is equivalent to 135 million euros. The minimum for under the Vienna Convention of 1997 is 338 million euros. However, one needs to remember that this limit is not established directly. It's up to the government of the respective country to set the limit in accordance with the convention's provisions. Russia has not established such a limit, which means that in the case of nuclear incidents in Russia as well as outside of Russia, the operator has an unlimited liability, and the same applies to the Russian state because it has a subsidiary liability for the operator. If there is not enough compensation available from the operator, the government will be jointly liable. The next slide can be safely skipped. You cannot see much here. What I was trying to talk about there is that we have looked at several cases that occurred in transportation from to and from various countries with various legal regimes. We identified nine categories of cases. In this particular case, we're talking about nuclear materials being transported from a Vienna Convention country to a country that has not joined any convention, for instance, from Russia to the US, South Africa, or Japan. In that case, the national operator will be liable, the shipper will be liable all the way to the border, and the recipient will be liable from the moment the materials enter the territorial waters or the boundaries of the country. Another case, transshipment from France, UK, any European country that is a member of the Paris Convention to any country that is a non-member. In that case, the operator's responsibility ends with the materials crossing the boundary, the border of the territorial waters. There is no cross liability here unless the Vienna Convention. The Paris Convention says that this convention does not apply in countries that are not members to the convention, which puts Paris-based countries' operators in a more beneficial position, unlike the Russian operators. Next, this is a situation whereby nuclear materials are shipped from a Vienna-based country, Vienna member country, to a non-Vienna member. We've talked about a similar situation already. Is a situation where shipments are made from a non-member of any convention to a member of the Vienna Convention, for instance, from the US to Russia. The Russian operator will be liable from the moment of when the materials are loaded onto the vessel, and there is some scope for transboundary, for some cross liability here. Another situation whereby a non-member ships to a Paris member. The shipper's liability ends when the ship leaves the territorial waters of the country, and this is when the Paris member's liability starts. Another scenario yet, when materials are shipped from a Vienna Convention member, for instance, Russia, to a European country that is a member of the Paris Convention, for instance, to France or to the UK. In this case, there is a cross-liability scenario. The Russian operator will be liable until the unloading in the destination country, whereas the Paris country operator will be liable from the moment the materials cross the Russian border. Next situation, the reverse scenario, where from Europe materials are shipped to Russia the European operator will be liable till the moment the materials cross the Russian border, and the Russian operator will be liable from the moment of loading. Another mutually beneficial situation is when countries are members of the same convention, for instance, the Vienna or the Paris Convention. In that case, change of liability is very clearly specified, but that moment can be changed according to the contract. This is in contrast to a situation whereby one country is a member and the other country is a non-member. In that case, these issues cannot be regulated by a contract, and imperative norms will apply. As Mr. Burns already mentioned, there is the mutual joint protocol that brings together the Paris and Vienna Convention, enabling member countries, member states of these conventions and members to of the protocol and their operators to share liability in the same way as if they were under the same convention. And finally, let me talk about a very concrete case when materials were shipped from Russia to Japan via the US or directly by sea around Africa. For instance, a Texnab export shipment. Material is shipped from a Russian enterprise to the port, to a Russian port. In that case, the operator continues to be liable. Then the material goes to the transshipment base in the UK, where the Russian operator will continue to be liable until the transshipment point, after which the UK carrier will be responsible. The materials will be shipped to Japan. The liability of the UK operator will continue until the territorial waters of Japan is reached, after which there is a change of liability to the Japanese operator. There are several instances of cross liability here. In such instances, both operators will remain liable in accordance with their conventions. The liability size will not be the same. In that case, courts that are competent to consider such cases in the event of incidents will use different frameworks. As a result, there is a risk of not providing adequate compensation to all victims for various reasons, including the time that it takes to settle the claims. Therefore, there is a lack of clarity which provision to apply in cases of cross liability or overlapping liability. Perhaps this is something that should concern the insurance companies as well, because when they do their valuation of the risks, they need to understand when these risks, under which circumstances these risks will occur, and when liability will need to be enforced, and sometimes it's difficult to predict. All right, let me make a few conclusions here. In the wake of the Fukushima disaster, it has become possible that similar changes will be applied to the existing conventions as it was in the wake of the Chernobyl disaster. Progress needs to be achieved with these regulatory regimes internationally. This would create benefits both for operators and potential victims. At this point, unification of regimes seems unlikely because of a number of differences. I believe that the main difference is in the economic standing of various states and their operators. There is a number of relatively wealthy countries that are prepared to set liability limits very high and include into liability coverage, for instance, environmental damage. This is something that's not covered by the 1963 Convention. Some less wealthy countries that are not so wealthy are not prepared to set the bar this high. As far as Russia is concerned, we believe that the operator's liability limit needs to be specified within our legal framework in order to create a level playing field vis-à-vis other countries' operators. it is going to be beneficial for the Russian state as well, because under our law the state is jointly liable. We need to also accede to the joint protocol in order to share liability with operators from Western Europe. I would like to leave it there, and if you have any questions, I'm ready to answer them. Thank you very much, Andrey. Do we have any questions? All right, Andrey, I have a question, I believe. You talked about a situation where there is a shipment going to the UK and there is a period of overlapping liability between the UK and Russian operators. What about the insurance companies? They will certainly charge an insurance premium for insuring against nuclear incident risks, including for that uncertainty period of time. Have you seen any cases of abuses in these situations whereby insurers would reject claims on the basis of overlapping liability or lack of certainty? I don't think so. As far as I understand, when the insurer takes upon themselves this risk coverage, they regard this as a situation identical to one where shipment is made to a non-member country. Therefore, they do not take into consideration the potential existence of liability on the part of the other operator. This is not something that affects their risk analysis or risk assessments. In other words, they don't take into consideration the UK operator. No, they're not supposed to account for the UK's operator insurance coverage. They need to act in accordance with the limits established by the Vienna Convention. That would be my answer. But of course, if there is an incident occurring inside a Paris member country, and the Vienna Convention limit is simply not enough to compensate for the damage because Paris has higher standards of liability, in that case, the provision of the Paris Convention will apply. Some of the damage will be compensated by the receiving operator. But as far as the Russian operator is concerned, they are only required to insure under the Vienna Convention. And the insurer doesn't really care whether or not the UK operator has Paris-based coverage. All right, thank you very much, dear colleagues. I would like to now introduce to you our next speaker, Pavel Rudensky, who represents the National Nuclear Insurance Pool. Is going to address liability insurance for operators, as well as the activities of the nuclear insurance pool in Russia. Thank you very much. Good morning, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. As Andrey said, I run the National Nuclear Insurance Pool. I also represent the respective association of insurance companies. In my presentation, I would like to focus on two issues. First, I'm going to describe to you the Russian National Insurance Pool, its structure, its activities, and then I will bring you up to speed on some of the progress achieved by the National Insurance Pool over the past 5 years. The pool brings together 18 Russian companies. The leading company among them is SOGAZ. What I'm showing you here is a table listing all the members and their shares. As you see, most of them have an international rating. We have 3 companies also with foreign participation on the part of Generali, Allianz AG, and ASXA Global and EBRD. This is our structure, our general meeting, our executive committee, which is represented by the management company. That company actually manages the insurance pool and the Russian reinsurance pool at the same time. The insurance pool, insurance against liability, whereas the reinsurance pool of companies insure against construction and assembly risks, property damage risks, and so on and so forth. We have a number of committees: the technical, financial, legal, and ad hoc committee. The company, the vehicle company for this pool consists of 7 officers. This is their photo. So this is very briefly about the pool. Let me now move on to the second part. Some of the financial highlights since 2008. As far as the pool membership is concerned, since 2008 we have seen a reduction in membership from 22 in 2008 to 19 in 2013. This is a result of some companies leaving us and some companies joining us. Over these years, the total capacity of these operators has increased significantly in the past years, and currently, cumulatively, stands at $200 million US, TPL and MD combined. We have an approved capacity for foreign operators, for foreign operations, both for TPL and for MD. Currently, it stands at $50 million US. There has been a change in the beginning of 2014 when we raised that capacity to $100 million. In May 2014, the cumulative capacity of Russian operations has been decreased somewhat as a result of the financial crisis, as well as some of the untoward developments that our members have seen as a result of some negative trends in the motor insurance market.
The limit of our liability is in 2013 is about 6 billion rubles. You can count it in dollars using the exchange rate of 335. The Russian insurance pool organizes international inspections. The first of them were carried out in 2009 in Leningradskaya, Balakovskaya power plants, Belayarskaya power plant, Kalininskaya power plant, and so on and so forth. Last year, we carried out inspections. We completed a 5-year cycle of inspections of all nuclear power plants, and this year we're starting a new cycle, using a new format and using new participants at Russian nuclear power plants. Apart from that, the Russian pool carries out the so-called internal audits at nuclear cycle enterprises and design institutes. We have 19 insurance policies. NRI is our reinsurance leader, that is the British nuclear pool. Sagas is the leading member of our Russian pool. Here on this slide you can see the changes in the capacity of the Russian insurance pool. As you can see, it was fluctuating quite significantly. In 2008 it was so high because we used not probably the very right estimates of insurance companies' payability, and then we had to decrease the capacity several-fold to $94 billion. And then, as the insurance companies continued to grow, our pool also grew. Companies usually keep in the pool about 7% of their free funds. These are our customers. Now, about the development of Russian insurance pool in the nuclear sector on the Russian market. Here you can see the cumulative liability of the Russian nuclear insurance pool for TPL and material damage. In case of a nuclear incident, you understand that there will be payments for as civil liability and against damages. The total amount will be about $80 million. Of course, we insure our liability in foreign insurance pools. On this slide, you can see the distribution of this liability by type of insurance. The first pie chart shows that our own pool is 44% of 6 billion. 56% are transferred to 16 foreign pools. And the leading here is the UK insurance pool. As far as material damage, our own part of liability is 18%, while we reinsure 82%. Apart from transferring risks of Russian nuclear power plants abroad, as I said before, we also accept incoming reinsurance, again, risks related to nuclear power plants and other nuclear cycle enterprises from our partners abroad. Now we are receiving risks from 19 countries. Here you can see the growth of the number of pools that have started transferring our risks. In 2014 it was 19 countries already. On the right you can see a pie chart showing the overall portfolio of insured and reinsured nuclear power units in the Russian insurance pool. 34 nuclear power units and 94 nuclear power units are foreign units that were reinsured at the Russian insurance pool. International inspections, as I said before, the first international insurance inspection was held in 2009, and the conclusion was by the International Pooling System, that is GPC, General Purpose Committee, the Executive Committee, that their finding was that Russian risks can be insured and reinsured. As I've already said, we completed the first round of inspections in 2013, and today, in accordance with the decisions of Rosatom and the Russian insurance pool, we carry out 2 fully fledged inspections per year. So all in all, a year there are 4 inspections. We're also planning to carry out internal insurance audits, 4 of them a year. Sometimes we do more. Our inspectors are certified surveyors, therefore they have the right to inspect not only Russian enterprises but companies abroad. And our inspectors in 2013 participated in 5 inspections abroad, in the UK, in Spain, in Taiwan, in China, and in other countries. Those are photos. So here is a list of countries where we participated in inspection teams. And my last slide says that, apart from that, the Russian insurance pool also acts as loss adjusters. Here you can see slides. On the left-hand side, there is a yellowish photo where you can see that a starter fell down from a height and Leningrad power plant, and it was a very heavy piece of equipment, 440 tons. And similar events also occurred at other power plants, and we carried out investigations into those incidents. If you want to get any more information about our pool and our possibilities, as capabilities, you can take a look at our website. Dear colleagues, do you have any questions about this presentation? We've entered a very interesting topic now. Okay, Andrey, sorry. My question is as follows. As far as I know, Rosatom selects insurance companies that can work in this field, including third-party liability. They have certain procurement rules, and based on what companies participate in Russian pools, well, not all of them have been selected by Rosatom. Can they really participate in insuring Rosatom risks, or maybe they reinsure something? Well, I'm not the best person to address this question to. Why Rosatom selected only several companies from our pool to work with? I don't know. Well, to make things simple, Rosatom uses the methods that were developed by RIASP on evaluating financial stability of insurance companies, and in accordance with that methods, some very well-known companies receive zero share in our pool. I think that Rosatom used our methods and selected the best from the list of pool members who are the most, who have the highest share, probably. I don't know exactly what was behind the Rosatom's decision. As far as insuring risks related to the transportation of nuclear material, we don't do it. We are not part of this process. Rosatom hasn't invited us. I would like to comment, Rosatom always selects the best. That's correct. Dear colleagues, we have touched upon a very relevant topic related to insurance of risks of third-party liability in case of nuclear incident, including during transportation, and the alternative to the classical conventional insurance is insurance through mutual insurance societies. This is a rather new institution that is part of our economic life now, and I would like to give the floor to our next speaker, Larisa Sachenko, who will talk about a general overview of mutual insurance societies and what kind of pluses and minuses and how in comparison with conventional forms of insurance. I would like to welcome all the participants of the forum. I would like to talk about a new format in the Russian insurance market, that is mutual insurance associations. And if we quote one of our classical piece of literature, we will remember that those who are drowning, it is up to them to save themselves. And in case of nuclear in case of nuclear incidents, nuclear installation operators should be in charge of saving themselves. I would like to say a few words about the reasons why these associations came into being, how they developed in the world, and I will say a few words about the analysis of their advantages and disadvantages that could be used in Russia. Does it work? So the structure of insurance coverage of nuclear risks is related to the specificity of those risks, catastrophic damage and low probability. But in spite of the fact that the probability is low, in order to cover such a big risk, you have a substantial financial capacity which is constantly growing. The international market reacts to it by consolidating capitals. National companies organize national pools, and they also join up with international pooling systems. At the same time, when capacity is reached, and certain market gaps occur because of monopolism, where market mechanisms are not at work at all. And then the insured is in a disadvantageous position. How can we react to the monopolism of pools and insufficient capacity of operators? Let's take a look at the history a little bit. In 1950s, at that time, the damages were evaluated, and at that time, consequently, national nuclear pools were created in many countries. About 20 years later, in 1970s, the pools became rather well-developed systems, and it's quite clear that their capacity is not sufficient. And at the same time, we need some compensation, some balancing factor to their monopolistic position. And here come nuclear operators who create the first mutual associations, first in the US and then in Europe. In the beginning of 2000s, following two situations where the insurance market in the beginning of 2000s was faced with a number of significant damages resulting from terrorist acts. You remember the 11th of September 2001, various hurricanes which damaged quite significantly the global insurance market. The market reacts to it by reducing coverage and increasing rates. At the same time, the mutual associations that were established in the 1970s had accumulated enough capacity, and the insurance, not only third-party liability but material damage insurance, is moved largely to these mutual societies from traditional companies. If we compare the capacity of these associations, we can say that the total estimated capacity of the global insurance system is $4.5 billion, while policies issued by the American Mutual Association, they have a coverage of $3 billion. So this is a fully fledged partner in insuring nuclear risks. If we take the situation that exists in the Russian nuclear insurance, we can compare it with the situation in which the global market was approximately in 1970s. Rather well-developed pooling system, but it requires additional capacity and some compensation against its monopolistic position. I think it is time now to talk about this instrument quite seriously, and that is all in the hands of the operators. So what do we mean by mutuals? A mutual insurance association is a non-commercial organization that insures similar risks of its participants. These participants are both insurers and the insured. They participate in a general meeting, what kind of risks to accept, at what conditions, what kind of acceptable risk there is. And then at the General Assembly they also decide whether new members could join the mutual or leave it. When participants exits from a mutual, it has a right for a certain share in its assets. So the operators have to sort it out themselves. So what are the pluses of such a form of an organization? Number one, the most important advantage of this form of organization is the possibility of distribution of losses. When there is a financial surplus at the end of the year, because of the absence of the incidents, it is carried forward to the next year. If the next year they distribute profit in normal companies, in mutual insurance it doesn't happen. It is carried forward every year in mutual association. When the mutual association is capitalized sufficiently, insurance premiums are decreased, and there are examples when insurance premiums were zero, while the quality of insurance cover was the same.
Another advantage is that the mutuals accepts the risks that are not taken by the conventional insurers. And this occurs because the mutuals are interested in that, and because the operators have a higher qualification personnel, and they can make good underwriting, and the professionals have a common language. They can discuss things, and they can take the mutual interests into consideration, and the activity of the mutuals is transparent for all the stakeholders, and it is aimed at meeting their insurance interests, unlike the conventional insurers, because naturally the ultimate goal for these is generating profit. Another advantage of the mutual is the so-called retrospective premium, and the premium could be paid in a lower amount with the reservation that if the loss exceeds a certain amount of money, then post factum, that is afterwards, the participants of the mutuals contribute a certain amount of money. And on the whole, the rates of insurance are 10-15% lower than the rates of the conventional insurers. And consequently, a certain fund or resource for investments is taken up, because the money does not leave the industry. So these are the advantages that account for the success of the mutuals. Well, to make the picture full, I should talk about the drawbacks, disadvantages. One, the capital, the wealth is virtually in one pocket, though quite recently the mutual reinsurance organizations are being developed, and that kind of system is growing. Another disadvantage is the same retrospective premium. On one hand, we can we can contribute a small amount, but on the other hand, if there is a loss, we will have to contribute more. It's not. It might not be quite pleasant. There are certain constraints, though it has been dealt with later, on the composition of the accepted risks. And another drawback is related to the long period of time needed by the mutual to accumulate. And I can give a number of schemes, insurance schemes, when the capacity of the mutual might be small, but the efficiency and efficacy and the structure of the coverage could be improved. With respect to the nuclear risks and the other risks. So, disadvantages versus disadvantages, we can say, and if we compare it with the conventional insurance market, and there is a table over here, in brief, the question is, could the mutual replace the conventional insurers? The answer is no, it's not possible, and the main reason why it is not possible is explained by the structure of the mutual capital. The conventional insurance is essentially full streamed water, which is draws water from many sources, and the resources are high, and but the mutual, it is just a fire protection lagoon pond which is nearby within an easy reach, but it cannot be a substitute of the full-fledged river. So mutual insurance associations, in my opinion, could complement the commercial insurance market, and they can offset the drawbacks of the conventional insurance market. And talking now about the situation at the Russian market, I may say that the mutual insurance is underdeveloped. There are a number of associations that have started their activity. For example, the developers, civil engineers, but there's not much experience amassed, but there is a law on mutual experience. There are established international practices, and here is a nice building. It is located a couple of quarters from over here. It is the first mutual credit associations, and it operated prior to the October Revolution in the early 20th century, and the mutuals were operating quite intensively and vigorously. And 100 years ago, our ancestors were filling the gaps of the conventional insurers and covering the risks that the conventional insurers were refraining from, and 30% of the market fell then in the early 20th century to the mutual. So it is quite a promising concept, and I would like to call upon the operators to make use of the mutual insurance in their protection structure. Thank you. Any questions? If not, the last but not the least presentation dedicated to the nuclear risk insurance by the mutuals. And I would like to give floor to Mr. Konstantin Sokolov. He is the representative of the Rosatom Treasury. That's the organization that is responsible for the insurance of the nuclear sector of Russia, and the policies developed by the Treasury specifies and designates the possibilities for the mutuals operations, and finding some kind of balance between conventional insurance and mutuals. Thank you. Good morning, dear colleagues. It is my presentation is of applied nature, and I'll be talking about the placing the risks, and talking about the European experience. We can say that it is timed to the international nuclear risk insurance getting more strict. It happened at the time when the limits, liability limits, were increased, and the insurers started to tread carefully with accepting risks for insurance, for coverage. And then the first one was European Mutual Association for Nuclear Insurance, set up in Brussels in 1978. It was an alternative to the commercial insurers. The members of the associations are the nuclear operators and the nuclear energy company from 16 states. The list of the companies is presented at the slide. And the abbreviation is money, and it insures assets and involved in reinsurance, and there is an insurance broker that is doing that. It is governed by the general meeting. One member, one vote, and there is an executive body of 14 staff, including the managing director, underwriting service, and office. The financial indicators of e-money since 1978 till 2013, the insurance capacity has grown from 9 million euros to 625, and the guarantee fund from 1.5 million to 230 million, and the insurance premium from 600 to 50 million. And the slide illustrates a slow rate of increase of the insurance capacity of the mutuals. And as far as e-money is concerned, it took 20 years to accumulate the required funds. Another one is Liability. It is a European liability insurance for the nuclear industry, and it is a mutual insurance association set up in 2002. It provides insurance for the nuclear operators. The members of the associations are nuclear facilities owners, nuclear operators, and major non-nuclear energy company from 15 countries of the world. So, what do the members of the Liability get when they cover their risks in the mutual association? They have an additional insurance capacity as a result of because of the revision of the Paris and the Vienna Convention. They have alternative insurance capacity, and the increase of the time limit up to 30 years, and it is the capacity for accumulating the insurance contribution, and they also have information database, and they can exchange information on nuclear insurance. The members of the Liability are 36 members. These are nuclear operators and the major non-nuclear energy companies. The list of them are presented at this slide. And the strategic governance is done by the board, the administrative management by the managing director, and there is a steering committee that is involved in the current activity. The crisis management starts in case of the events, and there is a possibility to kick it off any time. The crisis management is available 24/7 in cooperation with the NPP operator. And there's a mobilization of the contractors to the site, and at the same time there's a call center available and other communication means. There are transportation facilities provided, and multilingual procedure of registering the insurance events take place. And the commercial insurers are involved in insurance as well. The procedure is well defined, clear-cut. However, I don't know whether it was implemented, because the Rosatom annually has drills to drill the interoperability with the Russian nuclear insurance pool to arrange the payments at the site of the nuclear accidents. The slide shows the financial indicators of Liability. These are quite transparent, no need to talk at length about them. Let me talk about the NIRA, Nuclear Industry Reinsurance Associations. There are 42 members from Belgium, Holland, Czechia, Finland, France, Germany, Romania, Slovakia, Sweden, Switzerland, the UK, South Africa, the US, and Canada. The association has started its activity in 2010, and the members of the associations are also members of both e-money and e-Liability. The composition, the membership is the same. NIRA is involved in reinsurance of the risks with respect to property, liability, and construction and installation risks. The slide presents the financial indicators of NIRA. And the slide has the total insurance capacity of the European mutuals for 2013. And for the period of 25 years, the mutuals have managed to accumulate quite a substantial insurance capacity that could be compared with the insurance capacity of the conventional insurers. The Russian experience of the mutual insurance associations is not considerable. The legislature describes in details the activity of the mutual insurance associations. However, there hasn't been any application of the legislature. Larissa, though, has mentioned the first case. It is the mutual insurance associations of developers. It started its operation on the 1st of January 2014. The major task is to reduce risks and mutual loss compensation of the loss of the developers of the residential property. And at the moment, their developers are being enrolled into the associations. There is no experience of payments made in the society. Talking about the drawbacks and benefits, Larissa has talked at length about these, so I will skip it. I would like to talk about Rosatom experience. 2 years ago, Rosatom has made a survey of setting up the industry mutual insurance association. And however, the conclusion was negative. And it was decided against it because the major factors that influenced the decision were as follows. They coincide, though, with the major drawbacks of the mutual insurance associations. These being the necessity to stock the initial insurance funds, retrospective insurance, that is in case when there is an event, additional contribution will have to be made, and we estimate it will be up to between 6 to 10 annual premiums. The other is the lack of homogeneity of the insurers and the entities that are part of Rosatom are quite different financial status, and they are involved in different areas of business, different capacity output, etc. One of the reasons why not is slow capitalization of the mutuals, and we have estimated that to achieve the required insurance capacity, some 20-30 years would be needed. That's about it as far as the Industry Mutual Insurance Association is concerned. I have additional information. If you're interested, please get in touch.
Thank you very much, Konstantin. Unfortunately, we are really behind at this point. Initially, I was planning to have a very short Q&A or discussion, and I would still like to have it. Therefore, I would like to ask you the following question. As far as I understand, in the modern environment, there are at least 3 factors that may impact Rosatom's policy and Rosatom's decision to review its prohibition on the participation in mutuals. One of these factors has to do with the fact that Russia currently considers accession to the joint protocol, 1997 protocol, which will increase the current liability of operators from 6 to approximately 16 billion rubles in Russian money. This will entail an increase in contributions paid by the operators to insurance organizations. And again, this is my opinion only. I am not an expert in the economic dimensions of this, but still, I think this is going to create risks or potential risks for the Russian companies. The Russian companies will simply do not have enough liquidity, enough coverage in order to effectively cover the risks that will have to be covered after Russia accedes to the 1997 protocol to the to the Vienna Convention. Another factor is that in the beginning of June, Russia adopted its long-term program for the development of the nuclear industrial complex. That document envisions a number of sub-programs. One of the sub-programs under that umbrella program will be to increase the power generating capacity of Russian nuclear power plants. According to the plan, between 2012 and 2010, Russia will commission at least 1 gigawatt of capacity annually. In total, about 10 new reactor units will be implemented at new sites. And we are talking about brand new reactors at new NPPs. And this is certainly going to increase the overall risk of nuclear incidents. This will entail increased insurance premiums, and as a result of this, the pool may face capacity shortages. And the third factor I would like to highlight here, this is something very recent, the creation of the Eurasian Union, in which Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Russia are already members. Armenia is contemplating accession. Let me remind you that Russia is currently building a nuclear power plant. There is an intergovernmental agreement between Russia and the Republic of Kazakhstan, which also envisions the creation of a new nuclear power plants. Another MPP is being considered by Armenia. So what this is leading to is the emergence of a community of governments and states that have very strong economic links. that could serve potentially, in my opinion, as a platform for creating an international pool of insurance companies, potentially. So these are three factors that may influence Rosatom's decision when they consider repealing their decision, their policy. What do you think about this? Do you think these realities are going to really influence Rosatom's policy as the operating corporation, or is it just wishful thinking? Okay, let me go point by point here. Regarding the possible increase of the liability limit from 6 to 16 billion rubles that you mentioned, for that, Rosatom will have to consult in the first place with the Russian National Insurance Pool with regard to the possibility of placing these risks under the international system. When they are clear about what this is going to cost, they will proceed to calculating the potential effectiveness of a mutual society and whether or not it will be able to provide the additional capacity that will be created, that will be needed for this market. As far as the Eurasian Union is concerned, in my opinion, this is a welcome development. It is a welcome development because the inclusion of third country operators into the pool will disperse the risks that are more concentrated generally when they remain under Rosatom only. I have a brief comment. What about the law on mutual insurance? As far as I understand, in Russia, mutuals cannot act as insurers in the case of mandatory insurance. What about civil liability for nuclear damage? Does Rosatom view it as mandatory or voluntary insurance? Because if it is mandatory insurance, they will have to change the law. Otherwise, if it's voluntary, no changes in legislation will be required. Could you clarify this aspect, please? Yes, I think I can clarify this. Unfortunately, Russian legislation for these matters is either absent whatsoever or is still in its infancy. Therefore, there is no clear answer or clear provisions in Russian legislation with regard to nuclear-related insurance. Perhaps you could provide more details here. Well, let's be realistic, colleagues. The law on this type of mutual insurance was adopted in 2007 when very few people had an understanding of what it is. Therefore, the creation of developers' mutuals under a separate law is just the first shot, really, in this country. And let me remind you that only after significant changes were made to the law on mutual insurance societies, after these changes and amendments, did it become possible to establish such mutuals in practice. I don't think we should be saying that because there are inconsistencies in the 2007 law, we will never be able to implement mutuals in the nuclear field. The law is not the Bible, really. It will need to be revised and changed. May I also intervene here? And again, I think I'll go point by point here as well, and in the end I would like to provide a general comment concerning the status of mutuals in Russia. I was not really prepared coming to a legal forum to discuss the strengths and weaknesses of the two forms of insurance, civil liability insurance versus property insurance. But because I have some background in these matters and I could talk a little bit about how commercial insurers could play a role here, I would like to focus on financial security. We had a request from Rosatom. You may be aware that Mr. Shuvalov issued a certain instruction in accordance with which Rosatom asked members of the national pool to report on what capacity they would be able to provide in the event of Russia joining the 1997 protocol. So what happened, we sent inquiries out to our foreign colleagues. As far as the 16 billion liability limit is concerned, it's not going to be a problem because the international system is already insuring and reinsuring civil liability for $1.2 billion. We've had such cases before. So the problem is not really, doesn't really have to do with capacity. It has to do with some of the uncertainties contained in the provisions of the Vienna and Paris Conventions. Therefore, what we would like to see is for Russia to really be very specific when it develops its law on civil damage for nuclear incidents. Because if clear provisions are included in that law, if and when it is developed and adopted, we would be able to provide for an even greater coverage, an even greater capacity. I would also like to throw in a couple of remarks concerning the establishment and development of mutual societies. As far as I understand, we don't have people in this audience who have studied risk assessment or insurance business in depth. We mostly have lawyers here. So let me clarify this. When we say, let us create a mutual society, we need to understand very clearly that when we create it, there is no risk transfer. In other words, you do not transfer risks to another organization, to some other organization that will carry the risks. It's a form of self-insurance because you will continue to bear those risks. And this is going to create some problems. Financial problems, for instance. We mentioned on a tangent retrospective contribution payments. What is a retrospective contribution payment? It occurs in a situation when the operator says to the mutual, the risk is very small, so let's only pay 10 conventional units. But if significant damage arises, in that case, you will have to pay that significant damage. And the compensation may be 20 times greater. But in that case, the insurer will say, okay, you only paid 20 rubles. Now you have to pay 200 rubles because there's been an accident. And for property insurance, that kind of factor could run into 6 or 7-fold payments. Another factor that has been mentioned, the lack of homogeneity among the members. You know, some operators operate new stations, but then there are outdated NPPs that haven't been upgraded for a long time. If I'm a new operator, a new facility operator, why should I be liable to the same extent while operating my brand new reactor as is an operator in another country that is taking care of an outdated reactor? Why should I be coughing up tens of millions of dollars to pay for damages that occurred in a different part of the world? What's the reason? What's the incentive? Another observation, damage settlement, especially in civil insurance. Imagine the following situation. A settlement process is going for, say, Fukushima. There were tens of thousands of victims. how will society and Eleni, we don't know how many people work for Eleni. Let me tell you, there are 7 people. How are these 7 people supposed to settle those damages effectively, even if they join their forces with Imani? How are they going to settle? How are they going to make sure that the payments are made? These are not just insurance-related issues. These are social-related issues, political issues, really. And because you are supposed to self-insure, if there is a nuclear incident, it puts the operator generally into a very difficult financial situation by definition, and at that moment they also have to cough up some additional contribution, which is even a greater burden. So when we say we self-insure, we need to really be careful here and remember that the risks are not transferred to anybody else. And the last comment has to do with the the Eurasian community. Yes, we're very much in favor of joining efforts between nuclear risk insurers, for instance, but there is a reservation here. The additional capacity we're going to gain from our partners, from other countries, will not be very significant. It is no secret that the capacity provided by Belarus, by the Belarusian pool, is only 5 million rubles. Of course, we should be consolidating, but it will not be without question, without issues. Going back to the mutuals, one thing that was missed or perhaps was mentioned in those slides has to do with the assets. If we look at the assets represented by Imani, I believe they stand at about $200 million, whereas the liability runs into some $600 million. Any insurer will have questions about that. How is that possible? Let me explain. Sogaz made a profit of 12 billion rubles last year. Its liability runs into 500 million rubles. And that makes perfect commercial sense. But what about a society that consists of 14 members with rather small assets? How can they take upon themselves 1 billion worth of risks? Perhaps this is something for the rating agencies to look at, so that they could step in and really ask that question. How is that possible? I think I would like to wrap up here. Thank you. May I take a couple of minutes now? Going back to the discussion of retrospective payments. In my presentation, I mentioned that the meeting of the mutuals members may limit the retrospective payment. In other words, the members will adopt the size of that additional payment. They will agree from the very beginning how much it's going to be if the incident occurs, and under no circumstances can this contribution be increased after that. So that's one observation. Secondly, the lack of financial capacity of the mutuals. Well, for example, let's take NAIL, the US. Their capacity, their assets, are about $6 billion US. They already have a history of cases, and we know that they insure in total for 2.7 billion. I think 2.7 is the billion is the number. So I think overall it's quite balanced. And finally, regarding the comment that these mutuals may be useless, let me underscore once again, you don't need to work in one field only. because we're all in the same situation here, we all aim to provide comprehensive coverage for nuclear facilities operators so that they could compensate for the potential damage, because the compensation amounts will be enormous. And bearing that, from that standpoint, we need to provide additional stability factors. We cannot take just one tool as an example or as a reference here. There needs to be a variety of tools. Therefore, in the past decade, we have seen a third tool emerging in this field. And this is a tool that is growing. We didn't mention it. It's the CAD bonds. It's a financial instrument that provides added stability as a third element. And I anticipate there will be more tools emerging because there's an enormous demand for stability and financial security. There is a lot of responsibility involved in this business. Therefore, I think we should be on the lookout for whatever instruments can be used in order to ensure that stability. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. We're very much behind now, and I would like to now make some concluding remarks. First of all, I thank you for a lively discussion. I would like to be a placater here. We did not want to put classical insurance in conflict or in opposition to the mutuals. We see them as complementary institutions. I believe that this discussion will continue. The positive thing is that nuclear energy is going forward in the CIS countries, in Russia, in other countries as well, and in order to minimize the costs involved, in order to expand the coverage, in order to create alternative tools, we can and should be looking at the best practices from other countries. We should be looking at the possibility of creating mutuals if and when the economic prerequisites are right for that. In conclusion, I would like to thank the forum's organizers for giving us the opportunity to run this roundtable and the subsequent discussion. I would like to thank the speakers as well as the guests who came here today. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your commitment in discussing the agenda that we formulated today. Thank you.